All right. Well, thank you guys for your time this morning. My name is Christian Baldwin. I'm a managing director for Black Diamond Mergers and Acquisitions. And every quarter, we host a webinar. And the topic today is all about creating a business risk analysis. And so I'm pleasured this morning to be joined by Joe Anderson. Joe is with Buckner Insurance. He's a friend of mine. We had the opportunity to meet earlier this year and work on a transaction together that was in the elder care space in that industry. Joe is out of the Boise office, and he has a fantastic background. He's really got experience in a number of different industries: construction, manufacturing, healthcare, you name it, he's probably touched it. Very involved in their community. He and his wife have 5 children, ranging in age from 2 to 16, so no doubt he's a busy man. He's kind of an outdoors guy, fun to be around. What impressed me the most about Joe when we added him to our deal team to do the elder care transaction was the approach from the insurance perspective, because it wasn't one that was just, hey, here's a quote on a premium, let me get your insurance. Before we even got to that, he really wanted to understand the business, to do a complete, really risk audit. Okay, let's understand what drives the business, where are the risk levers, what can be done about those things moving forward. So I really have enjoyed getting to know Joe and see how he operates. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity, considering all of the craziness that we've seen in 2020 with the pandemic and everything else, to provide a platform to discuss some of these things. And then what we'll do is we'll have about 30 minutes of just Q&A between myself and Joe, and we'll touch on some of those points, and then we'll allow for 15 minutes after that session for anybody that has any questions. So does that sound okay, Joe?
Perfect. I'm excited.
All right, great. Okay, great. What are some of the most challenging things that you've seen this year in terms of insurance coverage, and then how has COVID really changed some of those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has been a fascinating year, and it started really last year a little bit, where we started seeing the property insurance market start to skyrocket. We saw a lot of real estate, habitational and specific, where there had been declines in premium for a long period of time, and all of a sudden the carriers said, hey, we got to get more premium, and it just turned on a dime. I had clients last year that, we renewed at 100% of the year before premium, even though there wasn't necessarily a lot of standard losses. We had some wind hail losses, which typically they'll put a deductible on, and it erases their exposure almost on those, right? So they shouldn't be rating for those. But we had really huge increases on the property line. And I think there's just a lot of reaction to a lot of these natural disasters that are happening. Even if you're not in that zone, they still react, or your building may not be exposed. I had a skyscraper in Denver, 9 stories with a ballasted rock roof, right? Steel construction. And the company wanted to give me a 40% increase with no losses. And I said, why? And they said, well, we have a lot of wind hail. I'm like, well, hello, it's a ballasted rock roof. So it's just very interesting what happens in our business when insurance carriers decide to turn the corner and things are turning hard, is those frontline underwriters, their discretion level is shrunk, and they have to send everything up to upper management for approval. And it makes the process longer, harder. There's more concern about how many times I'm going to spend my silver bullet with upper management. So it really makes it a challenging environment. The other line that we really saw some significant challenges on was umbrellas and the excess market. Umbrellas are going to go over general liability, auto liability, employer's liability for workers' comp, and they give you excess coverage. And so what we saw this last year was the companies decided to scrutinize those umbrellas. I mean, I would write a property or an account, and normally it would be maybe $20,000 in premium for a small apartment complex, let's say. I write some really large accounts too, but that was one part of a bigger group. And we would just get a 5 million quote automatically. And they would just say, here you go, here's 5 million, right? Cheap price. This year, no way. Those small accounts, they would only quote $1 million. And if you wanted more, you'd have to justify it. And then the underwriter for the umbrella, which is the excess liability, asked 5 times as many questions as the underwriter for the general liability, who's in the first $1 million, right? Well, that seems backwards, right? It's just not logical. So we saw a lot of what I would call perceived risk decisions versus real risk decisions. And those are 2 terms I want to kind of mention for your clients, Christian, to think about. We mostly think in terms of real risk, and we're pretty good at assessing that as business people. However, reality is a lot of pricing comes from perception, what the underwriter perceives the risk is, because they're not on the ground, they're not there. And so how we change that perception is very important, and try to create a positive perception in their minds.
That's great. That's a great overview. Joe, if you're working on a transaction like what we do or what we did together, we've got a prospective buyer that's buying a business, how do you walk that purchaser through the steps of what they need to think about? Like what kind of risk advice would you give the purchaser of a particular business, and what areas do you cover in that risk mitigation?
It's sometimes a interesting position, because so much time is spent on the price and the revenue and some of those things, and sometimes it's tempting not to look at the risk because it's unknown or it's hard to measure, right? Sometimes, but it's critical. And so our risk management process that we work with clients on works well also for transaction risk, but with some tweaks. But basically, before we talk about insurance coverage and those things, we take about 3 steps backwards. And we look at the supply chain of that operation. And we look at all of the interactions that they have with what I call the universe. So that's going to be clients, investors, government entities, employees, transportation groups that ship their product, or vendors like IT vendors that help them with their services. And those can create risk. And so in the same vein, when you're buying a company, you want to come in like an investment analyst would for Google or Apple and try to analyze that risk in the supply chain. And that's one of the major areas that we help clients with. Once we can kind of identify that risk and how they operate, then we look at kind of what we call vicarious risk, or risk that kind of just sits out there that's there, and we help them with that. As far as transaction risk itself, there are some tools on the insurance side to transfer that risk. So as you get into certain deals sizes, maybe in excess of $5 million in value, you can actually transfer that transaction risk to an insurance company. It's called representations and warranties insurance. And that will cover misrepresentations from the seller to the buyer. It'll also cover potentially tax issues and some environmental issues as well. And what that can allow the sellers to do is to not worry about recourse, right? So they can then take their money and reinvest it and not have to keep it in escrow or in a bank account. And the buyer has more confidence in that transaction. So that's one area where I think a lot of people don't think about that, but that representations and warranties insurance is very interesting on some of those deals. So that gives you a couple of angles to look at risk, but we would just kind of walk through with them the business operation risk, the contractual transfer risk. So that's the other piece. How do they contract with their clients, with their employees, trade secrets, those types of things to protect the things that add value in their company. And analyzing that language in those contracts can be every bit as important as making sure that they have a good supply chain.
A manufacturing example, let's take that for just a second. How often do you find that business owners are not even fully aware of maybe their current coverage or the risk points that they have in their business? And if you do a risk audit for them, how often are they maybe surprised to find out that, you know what, if you do a few small things, you can really save money, increase safety, and that sort of stuff? Walk us through that process.
I'll use a little example. There's a tech company out here I used to work with that manufactured routers, okay? And I started working with them when they were about 6 million. They grew to about 34 million while I was working with them. And they just got purchased by Intuit, okay? So it was a pretty big acquisition. When I started working with them, they had a business income policy on their headquarters. So business income extra expense is going to cover loss of revenue and extra expenses if you can't utilize your building, right? If you have a fire or something like that. Well, when I talked with them and we did the risk audit or the review, I asked them, I said, you know, what would happen if you had a fire at this headquarters building? Well, these are all kind of software designers and stuff. And they said, well, we just go home and work. I said, okay, interesting. Well, then I said, okay, but you're manufacturing a product and you're doing that off season. In this case, it was over in Taiwan. And I said, what would happen if that plant in Taiwan went down? And they got pale. And they said, whoa, that would create a huge supply chain interruption for us. I said, why? Well, it takes 4 months to get our product over on the slow boat. And they have specialized equipment that make our product that nobody else has. I said, okay, now we're talking. So we then went in, analyzed the risk if that manufacturing facility offshore in Taiwan went down, right? We were actually able to buy a policy on that building in Taiwan through the U.S. Embassy, through some of my contacts. So that's called a dependent business income policy, property policy. And then they had like a $4 to $6 million limit on that because that was huge exposure for them. So these are the kinds of things, Christian, that happen when we dig in and we really understand the client. And one of the things I like to tell clients is you're the best risk manager. You know the business well. You're just so close to it. Sometimes you don't know what you know. So our job is to draw that out and really get you to ask it. We ask good questions. We draw that out from our clients. And then we use our skills and our industry knowledge to be able to kind of say, hey, what about this? Or how do you want to deal with this? And it's always surprising to see how we can restructure things. It doesn't always cost more money. It just means we're better covered, right? Or we have a better plan. And that's really fun. So I don't know if that example helps and kind of talks directly to what you were asking.
Yeah, that's a great example. What about healthcare? Obviously, with COVID this year, things have been really crazy in that industry. What's an update from your side on, you know, how hospitals and nursing homes and that whole sector, how are they viewing, rewriting insurance right now? And what's the forecast in 2021, do you think, as vaccines start to get more prevalent?
Yes, it's a great question. I want to kind of approach that in two ways. One is to talk about the insurance component in that industry, but also talk about the framework for assessing risk and why that's important, even in unknown waters, right? Unknown situations like COVID. So the first is the insurance. And that particular area, what we've seen is this panic in the market of unknown because of COVID. And part of that comes because there has been no formula or pre-planned disaster recovery business continuity structure to the COVID response. And we can blame whatever administration we want, but we got surprised by it. We didn't have a great plan, in my opinion. And so we knee-jerked all the way through it. And so what that does with insurance companies and people managing risk is there's a lot of unknowns and they don't really know where you're going, right? And that's a challenge. So what we've seen is those professional liability underwriters that are managing risk for communicable diseases and, you know, making sure these patients are being treated fairly and all this stuff, that's gone through the roof. We've seen senior living facilities, like assisted living facilities, have 300-400% increases on their premium. A little bit less on the nursing home side. If the other thing that's happened is there's been a huge fear that if there's any survey write-ups on those properties, so what happens is a surveyor is going to go out and say, hey, we want you to do this different, or we want you to do this different. And there's core and non-core surveys, recommendations. Core is usually worse. Even if non-core surveys are there, what happens is the underwriters, where before they were fine with those, now they're worried about litigation. So they're worried about a company coming into that facility and saying, well, my parent or my grandparent died of COVID, right? A person. And even though you may not have done anything there, we don't think you were up to the normal standard because you had these survey issues. And so the surveys have played a huge role in whether or not we get better pricing. And if they have bad surveys, their pricing gets jacked. So what we do is we go on the front end, get the surveys, get them to give us what they've done to respond to those surveys, really educate the underwriter on the front end, 90, 120 days out even, because if we try to push all that through at the last minute, they just price up. So that's kind of a little bit on the insurance side. The property rates and the auto have gone kind of down. The work comp rates have gone down this year, but we anticipate those to go up next year as COVID catches up with those rates. In the work comp business, those claims end up delaying about a year in how they reflect in the overall premium through the experience mod. So, or the experience modifier. So yeah, I would say overall it's been very tough. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is how do you prepare for any kind of risk? And that's having a system to analyze risk or to look at cost of risk in your organization. And for the organizations that I've worked with who've spent significant time in managing risk, they've fared better in the senior living space with COVID because at least they had a framework to build off of, even if it was an unknown risk, right? And so the companies that were just kind of cruising along, not spending a whole lot of time on their risk management framework, they got caught off guard. And all of a sudden they're like, where do I go and what do I do? And there's no real base to build off of. And so that is one of the reasons why it's important to have a good risk management function and organization in all your departments, is that framework then helps you be able to respond and react and adjust to new risks because it's already in place.
What's an example of a company that maybe not mention them, you don't have to mention them specifically by name, but just one that you have been really impressed by their risk management function and how they manage that? And then what do they do that makes them really good at that?
Yeah, so I have a company in town that does a lot of property management and very well capitalized. So they've kind of stored away cash a little bit, but also have built a culture where all the departments can come in and have input. They've actually invited me in to talk with their executive team on risk issues. How do we manage risk? How do we look at risk? And then they've gotten involved in preventative or predictive risk assessment. And so what I mean by that, and a lot of people these days throw out KPIs or key performance indicators. You guys have probably heard of those, right? And you get these dashboards and you say, how is this company doing? And you can kind of see how you're doing in real time. And those are great. And those are really important. In the risk side, we look at key risk indicators. And key risk indicators are going to be indicators in your operations that say, hey, here's a problem because we've had a number of hits here, right? We've had a number of issues here. And so you identify those key risk indicators in an organization, and it allows you to sound the bells and alarms a little bit earlier than everybody else. And you can respond quicker, and you have a set, maybe even a set plan in a lot of instances of how you're going to respond. So this company, when COVID hit, they had some of those things in place. They were able to communicate with their employees. They had built those communication channels. They were getting ground up information from their property managers and maintenance people of what the issues were. They had the cash to be able to go in and help them, right? And so now I just talked to them this morning, actually, and they said, we feel really well poised for 2021 because we rode the storm, right? We were able to ride through this. And that's where the opportunities come, is on the back end of a challenge. If you can write it at a more efficient or a more controlled manner than everybody else, you're kind of poised to take advantage of those opportunities for acquisitions, for expansion down the road. I wonder, is that what you kind of find, Christian, on your end as you're talking to people who are buying?
On both sides, it's really important. For a company that is selling, if they've already done a good job of their risk management function and they have a plan in place, that company's actually worth more money than one who's not, right? Because every buyer is going to go through some sort of risk analysis, whether they realize they're doing that or not, right? And because they're going to want to see, okay, what kind of insurance is in place today and what does it cover and all that good stuff. So the ones that have done a really good job with this, inherently they have more value to the business. If I have a really low modifier rating and I haven't had any issues over a certain period of time, and I have a plan in place to manage them correctly, then the buyer's more comfortable, right? They're going to put a higher value on that business compared to one that has a lot of issues, a lot of claims, for whatever reason, kind of loosely been managed in that area. So I think industry is also very important too, just by nature of certain industries. Some are riskier than others, and so those are all really important factors. And then in a mergers and acquisitions deal, depending on some of those answers, can dictate whether or not the buyer would potentially do a stock transaction versus an asset deal. Well, why does that matter? Well, there's tax implications for the seller. So a loosely designed and implemented risk management function from a management team can really cost them a lot more money when they go to exit the company if they don't do it well and do it right, because it could lean towards a different tax implication when they sell the company.
Wow.
And I found that most business owners haven't really thought about that on the front end, right? Okay, if we do a good job now, then it could save us some taxes later because we're maybe more likely to structure a deal a certain way that's going to be perceived less risky in the end. So I think there's a lot of factors that are kind of tentacles of those decisions, certainly.
That's fascinating, Christian, because as you were talking, I was just thinking about, it's even a part of estate planning. As you're planning out how you're going to exit a company, you have to keep in mind that the best exit strategy, and that involves risk, right? So they all come together. It's kind of cool.
The estate planning is another good part of it. So, on our deal teams, we've got accountants and typically attorneys, business attorneys, and then the insurance function is one. And then so if our clients have trusts and estates as owners of the business, then they would sometimes have their trust attorney as a part of our deal team too, just to make sure that all that continuity is done throughout. And so there's, the risk audit from your perspective doesn't just stop with the sale of the business, for example. It can continue on to make sure their personal assets, because if they're getting a windfall, then, if that goes into their trust, they want to make sure that it's covered correctly and whatnot. Are there any industries, Joe, that you've seen that have projected big changes coming up in terms of risk and risk audit? There's some, in my mind, as I sort of listen to the news and things that are technology driven, like driverless cars, for example, is a big one that we kind of see that could happen in mainstream over the next decade. We'll see more of that probably. Other supply chains and things like that. Technology is driving a lot of our economy and will, of course, continue to do so. What's the outlook, right, just in general over the next few years for big technology changes?
I think the transportation side of things with the telematics, which are, going to be everything from sensors that sense how far away from the car in front of you are, to cameras that can record accident scenes real time and be able to help mitigate he said, she said issues on an accident, to GPS tracking and being able to look at speed going in and out of an accident or an issue and be able to recreate that scene that way. We have guys that are pros at that, and a lot of my clients are using those guys on the safety side to be able to minimize their risk there. so that you bring up one very interesting one there, Christian. I think other areas that I see some emerging risk, we're looking at interesting things on the healthcare side in regards to how service is managed and what the expectations are of that service. So I think that's a big one. Same thing in the restaurant hospitality industry, where the cleaning standards have been super high for COVID, and it creates a lot of cost for those individuals, but they get half the revenue because they can't keep as many rooms or as many tables open. That creates a very different picture for them of financial health. And so how does that look post-COVID, and which ones of those measures are going to go away versus which ones are going to stay? And I think when you're looking at services industries like that, that's going to be a big one. So I think healthcare and the services industries are the ones that are really looking at the most change or risk change in this current environment.
On the healthcare side, as more and more physicians adopt technology and in the form of telemedicine, what does that do for their risk exposure in a company like that?
You know, it's fascinating because, you know, you would have to pay usually a certain office visit fee every time you went in to see the doctor, right? And this would be kind of common. And now you have telemedicine, and you have these on group health plans and all these kinds of things, right, for doctors. And so it's transforming that industry. And it's opening up opportunities for non-traditional medical providers to be able to help out as well. For instance, your functional medicine or holistic medicine folks are getting more engaged in that telemedicine side. There's a shift going on in some ways from medicine in a sense of let's treat this with a drug to medicine in the sense of let's enable your body to fight better, right? And we're seeing that in analytics with like one of my clients called Functional Medicine Idaho. They basically will do an expanded blood test and be able to tell you all the areas beyond what a normal physician does that you need to improve in, and do that over the phone, right? And then they recommend supplements and eating habits and diet and exercise, and then you go do that, right? And that's very, very helpful. So I think going forward, my hope is that we approach these situations like COVID, not just playing defense, but also playing offense more. And offense means how do we put our immune systems in a better position to fight the disease, right? And so whatever the next issue that comes through pandemic-wise, I think we got to look at both and really encourage people, because people get tired of playing defense. If there's fear and there's panic and they can only play defense, you can only do that for so long. And it's like, man, this is rough, right? But if they feel like they have a good action plan, then they get excited about that. So that's kind of some of my thoughts there.
Great. That's great perspective. Well, right